right, the numbers slowed down, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to have some more people join us because we've had over 175 people register for today's call. Let's see, that number's still ticking up. Let's go ahead, though. We'll just do some introductions. I've got some opening comments I'd like to share. Welcome, everybody. I'm Lyle Hanna. I'm the head of the Hanna Resource Group, and this is our 15th Zoom call on the crisis management for COVID-19. We did a little siesta here, took a little time off, and boy, this thing has come back like a storm, and by popular demand, we're back like a storm. We're delighted that you're joining us, and we got a whole team of great people we're going to introduce to you and talk about today. Listen, our last call, I told you that I had the call from the health department, and they had told me that I had been exposed to somebody who had COVID-19, and so I needed to get tested. So I went and had a test. It was negative. 96 hours later, I had a second test, and it was negative, and I had one over the weekend, and it was negative. So I'm delighted to say I seem to be negative. My wife said, we've known that for 40 years. I'm glad I finally discovered that. Actually, I'm pretty positive most of the time, but in this case, I'm glad I'm negative. We have a lot of things to talk about today, but one of the reasons we're back today is because as of last night, we had 19,389 cases in Kentucky. On Sunday, we had 277 new cases. This is not good. That represents a 49% increase over the prior week. If you look at it week over week, first week of July versus second week of July. That is a rapid pace of growth, one that we would like if we were raising money, but we're not. We're losing people. That's not good. We've lost 625 people in the state of Kentucky, and there are more to come, I'm afraid. You notice on this slide, the IMHE, that's kind of the global standard for projections, and they're saying a conservative projection is that by November, we will have lost 1,139 people. If there are friends of yours or relatives of yours, I know you'd be serious. I've lost friends, no relatives yet, but I'm serious about this, and I want us all to take it serious. So that's why I got a few more opening comments. Let's flip to that next slide. Look, we don't have a solution. It's not a perfect solution, but right now what we have is we need to be wearing masks, we need to be social distancing, and we need to practice proper washing of hands and other things around us. Just 3 simple rules can make a big difference. But we brought on a special guest today to really give us some more information about this. And his name is Dr. Mark Doherty. And he has his own infectious disease practice in Lexington, Kentucky. They're known around the country. He has 11 experts, doctors that work in that practice, but he is also the chief epidemiologist for Baptist Health, Baptist Hospital locally. And so he is on the front line. He's the general that's fighting this stuff. And before he speaks, I want to give you just a couple more statistics. But you notice we've got Jim Morris back. He's our attorney, and oh my gosh, a lot of stuff has happened. We thought it was going to slow down. It hadn't really slowed down. So the doctor's going to speak first, and then Jim's going to talk. And then we got Allison and Autumn and Chase are tracking stuff. They've been doing it all week. And somebody was waving at me. Oh, that was Allison waving at everybody. Thank you, Allison. And let's flip to the next slide. This just kind of what we're going to do. We got the current situation first with the doctor. Then we got some legal stuff. Then we're going to do back to school just briefly, talk about that, and really prep for a lot more we're going to do next week. But then let's go one more slide here. And I found this slide really fascinating. Oop, no, other direction. Right there. This is a really cool slide that talks about the different risk levels for different activities. And we're going to send this to you and share it with you. Go to the next slide, Jim, because that's too hard to read that one. So we broke it into 2 slides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is really helpful. You know, opening mail, playing tennis. That's what my wife does. So she lobbied to get this really low on the list. But a lot of these other things are a lot higher. So going to the beach and shopping at the mall and spending time sending kids to school. You see, these things are still in the higher levels. Flip to the next one. Those are all kind of moderate lists. Now look at these things. Here are the really tough ones. So eating at a buffet, most of those are closed, but you got a lot of things here. I just think that's helpful. It might be helpful to educate our employees. One of the things I'm trying to do today is help us help our state. And I want to do that because on this call, We're up to 127 people. We'll have more than that before it's over. But we calculated how many people that represents, and it's over 50,000 employees across the Commonwealth and through other areas. Most of our people are from Kentucky, but we have people on the call from around the nation too. But we, as employers, have the opportunity to influence people. And now is the time to do it, because we're not fighting this epidemic the way we should. We've got to get organized and focused and do a better job at it. And I think the employers can help drive that if we spend some time educating our people. Not that easy to do all the time, but we need to step up and try to do that. So let me pitch this over. I'm going to give it to Mark, and we're going to do a quick survey as he starts. This survey is going to be just a quickie. We want to know where you stand. We actually posted a survey when we sent the announcement out to you, but not very many people did it. So if you don't mind, just click on these 3 questions, give us some feedback, and let us know what you think. While you do that, let me finish telling you about Mark. Graduate of University of Virginia and got his medical degree there. He's also studied at Rochester, a number of places around the United States. He really is highly regarded nationally for all that he does in terms of infectious diseases. He's in the front line here. So he's got people working day in, day out, dealing with all these people that come into the hospital. Mark, let's all answer these questions and we'll pitch it to you and you take it away. If you have questions, notice the chat box down below. I notice we've got 2 things down there already. Let's keep the questions coming in and we'll round them up for you, Mark.
Well, first off, this is a disease unlike any that we've ever faced before. So we have a highly contagious pathogen, but it can present in a myriad of ways. It can present in 40 to 50% of the patients have either no symptoms or minimal symptoms, all the way up to overwhelming illness with multi-organ system failure. It's not always easily predictable which patients will become more ill after they get infected, but it's generally people who are older than 60, people who have other comorbid conditions like lung disease, COPD, asthma, immunocompromised patients. But younger patients can become ill, and it can be, it's a disease process that can also present in unexpected and unusual ways. We knew that from the experience in China that most people had respiratory symptoms that became ill and could develop respiratory failure. We knew that there would be an issue with ventilators and potentially not having enough ventilators. One of the things we didn't know was the thrombotic complications that could occur. So up to 25% of patients will have deep venous thromboses, pulmonary embolism, myocardial infarction, and stroke. And our first patient that actually presented here at Baptist Lexington presented with a stroke and no real other symptoms. He bled into his brain, herniated, and died right around the time that we figured out that he had COVID-19. A number of our other patients have had clots and strokes and heart attacks. And so one of the things that we've learned is that we need to focus on anticoagulation in some of the sicker patients, both in the hospital and out of the hospital. When this whole thing started revving up here in March, we were kind of floundering around. We didn't have enough testing. The testing was taking 10 days to come back. We didn't know who had it and who didn't have it. And we were burning through our precious personal protective equipment while we were waiting for all the testing to come back. Some of those things have gotten better. So we're better at getting the testing back more quickly now. We have better access here, especially in Lexington. Some of the companies here have really stepped up and provided much faster turnaround in the testing. Lexar, which was a toxicology lab beforehand, switched over to doing primarily coronavirus testing. Solaris is doing over 1,000 tests a day, just like Lexar is. So we're in better shape than a lot of other places in the country. In Florida now, with the outbreak down there, people are having to wait hours in line to try to get tested, 4 or 5 hours. You can see the long traffic lines. Testing is key because otherwise we're blind and we don't know who has it and who doesn't have it. We know that, I mentioned that the disease has a wide spectrum. We know that some of the people who are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic are shedding massive amounts of virus and can be contagious to others. And early on in the illness, some of the virologists that I talked to indicated that they had never seen a disease process before that had even remotely close to the viral burden that some of these patients have, just the most virus that they had ever seen. So it looks like some people, and it's hard to predict who, are what we call super spreaders, have massive amounts of virus that they're shedding, sometimes with minimal or no symptoms. So that makes it very difficult to know, who to pinpoint and try to, protect yourself or protect the public. That's different than SARS, than the first SARS that came out, because all those people, when they became ill, they were symptomatic. You knew if they had respiratory symptoms, hey, we stay away, distance, put a mask on, and so forth. Right now, it's crucial to have universal masking in enclosed spaces. It's not important outdoors if you're more than 6 feet away. I mean, and by the way, I don't think 6 feet is sort of an estimate. That's something we probably should shoot for, but I think we have to realize that the 6 feet issue is really a continuum, and it depends on the environment and what the behavior is. If it's indoors and there's singing involved for a couple of hours, 6 feet's probably not enough. And you probably shouldn't be singing indoors or yelling and shouting without a mask on. As it ends up, I think we've all come to the conclusion that the mask is crucial in preventing spread of this disease process. I don't think we would be where we are right now if we had realized that earlier on, and if we had gotten better advice from the CDC, the WHO, the Surgeon General, and so forth. We got bad advice from the beginning, and the mask is crucial to prevent the respiratory droplets that are the primary mode of spread. Initially we were concerned about fomites and surface spread, and I'm not saying that it's that you shouldn't wash your hands. I've spent my whole 32-year career saying, people need to wash their hands to prevent spread of staph infection and all the other pathogens that we see. But if you just wash your hands and wear gloves and don't wear a mask, that's going to be a problem. So when I see, when I've seen restaurants and they have gloves on and they say they spray the floor down and spray the tables down, well, that's all well and good. But if they don't have a mask on, that's not going to mean anything. So the masking is just absolutely critical. I think if we had been doing this, if we had had everyone masking all along and there hadn't been so much confusion at the very beginning, that we wouldn't be in the position that we are. We wouldn't be in the position with people dying, with the hospitals in some states getting overwhelmed, and with the economy just being shut down or partially, previously shut down and now at risk, at least in some areas of the country, of being shut down again.
Can you, Chase, can you put up the results from our little survey? I thought this might help you.
Okay. Are you
Okay.
seeing COVID spike activity? Yeah, no, 81%. Are you in favor of the governor's masking mandate? Yes, 74%. No, 27%. Do you believe your employees are taking mask wearing practices seriously? 77%. Well, I have to tell you that I was really disheartened when in previous weeks when I saw that people just weren't taking it seriously and weren't wearing masks. And that's the single most important thing that people can do by far. And it's not to protect yourselves. That's what everyone's been thinking from the beginning, but it's to prevent you from expelling the respiratory droplets that are infecting other people. So it's a disservice to others to not wear a mask. And I think that if we see people out in public, in enclosed spaces, not wearing a mask, we need to say something to them. And that's what I've personally been doing. Now, a few weeks ago, after not going out anywhere for 2 or 3 months, I did go to Kroger's wearing a mask, and I would say probably 30 to 40% of people wearing a mask. I was encouraged on Saturday when I went, and every single person in Kroger's had a mask on. And so I think that the governor's mandate has made a difference, or at least starting to make a difference. I was really concerned when I traveled to Kiowa, South Carolina the second week of June. We rented a house down there and just pretty much brought our own food. And, we're out on an open beach, which is, by the way, not a place you're going to get coronavirus. I mean, unless you're on top of someone on the beach. But that's probably the least likely place to get it unless you're just right on top of each other. Outside in an open environment, away from each other with the breeze, that's not going to happen. It's going to happen in enclosed spaces where people aren't masking. Bars are a huge risk. Church is a risk if you're singing and people don't have a mask on. It's those type of environments, weddings where you can't socially distance, it's meant for intimacy, just like a bar is, you're up in each other's face. Those are places that are very, very high risk. The masking is pretty simple. I mean, just look at what happened in China. How did they control it? How did Japan control it? How did South Korea control it? Okay, they had public health measures and they did tracing and things like that. But the single most important intervention they made was everyone has a mask on. If you look at the pictures, it's just common sense. It's not some genius move. It's an inconvenience to have a mask on. I wear one, you know, if I'm in my own office here and I don't have to wear a mask if I'm just by myself in a closed office. But otherwise, when I'm out on the floors, I'm wearing a mask usually 12 to 14 hours a day. It hurts the back of my ears. It's very annoying. But we have to do that, and it's a relatively simple thing to do, an inexpensive thing to do, and the only way that we're going to get this whole situation under control without a vaccine. I'm very concerned about what's happening now in the states in the South. You know, I have to tell you, when we drove down to South Carolina, I saw almost no one in Tennessee, North Carolina, or South Carolina wearing a mask. And they're going to pay the price, and they are paying the price right now. I'm afraid the same thing's going to happen to us. It feels to us like it's revving up. I'm getting more calls. We're getting more patients coming in, more, you know, multiple calls a day about, okay, my daughter went to this party and she got exposed. What do I do? And calls from all over the place. So I think opening the bars the way that it was done was problematic. Not having people being engaged and really knowing how serious wearing a mask was, and having the 4th of July and everyone feeling like, okay, we've just had enough. We've done it for 3 or 4 months. The economy was shut down. I'm done with it. And at least that's kind of my impression. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to really shut the economy down again like we did. I just don't see it happening. We just can't do that forever. So we're going to have to deal with it. And the best way to deal with it is, number one, wear the mask. And number two, we have to not have the hospitals get overwhelmed. We know how to deal with this infection much better than we did at first. We figured out some things pretty early on that have ended up being very beneficial. We were the first hospital in the country, other than one in Houston, to give convalescent plasma. So we did that the last week of March. We saw that the FDA came out with an investigational protocol, and you know, I'm helping organize and run things here. I assigned one of my hematologist friends to get that up and running, and we did that starting on Friday afternoon at 1 o'clock, and by 5 o'clock, we had approval at an emergency meeting for the IRB, the Investigation Review Board, and from the FDA to start doing it. We got the Kentucky Blood Center on board, and they called in people over the weekend after we had identified a potential donor and plasmapheresis on Sunday, and we gave the first 2 patients the convalescent plasma therapy on Sunday night. That's ended up, I think, being an important component of our treatment regimen. Early on, we were concerned about giving steroids early in the illness because it seemed like it increased viral secretion and the viral load, and it might not be a good idea. We were giving it sort of later in the illness. Some studies have come out now from the UK, the recovery study, showing that you have an improved survival rate if you give steroids earlier, not when people aren't really ill, but as soon as they become hypoxic, their oxygen level's low, they require hospital admission. So we're starting people on a steroid decadron. As soon as that happens, we consider that an indication for convalescent plasma. And then we're also giving the new antiviral from Gilead, remdesivir, all 3 of those things. And we feel like we've really made a turnaround in the treatment, preventing people from having to go on the ventilator and dying. Now, unfortunately, because some places like in Florida have been overwhelmed, my friends down there don't have any convalescent plasma. They don't have any remdesivir. They've all run out. So when I had talked to one of my friends yesterday, and they had ordered convalescent plasma on a 47-year-old with no other medical problems, and It took them 4 days. They got it to her bedside as she died. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when we just can't be overwhelmed after we have potential treatments. We have some resources, but they're limited resources, and we have to acquire more of those resources in order to save people's lives. And also, I should mention, it's not just about saving lives. Some people that go on to develop respiratory failure and end up on the ventilator with ARDS type or adult respiratory distress problems are going to have disability for the rest of their lives. They're going to have lung scarring. They won't ever be the same. They won't have the same functional capacity, same exercise capacity. Some of the people that have strokes, of course, won't recover from that. Some people that have heart attacks won't recover full heart function. So it's not just about surviving the illness, but it's about subsequent disability from the illness also. I think those are the main messages that I want to get across. One of the other things I want to say is that, behind the scenes, there's just a huge, massive effort in the pharmaceutical and medical community to try to turn things around here, to try to develop vaccines. So you cannot imagine how many different therapeutic things that are being discussed and that we've been offered here for studies. One of the studies that we're getting ramped up to do is using a pill called that's a calpain inhibitor. So it's a certain pathway in the immune system, and that pill can inhibit IL-6, which is what happens when that level goes up when people go into the hyperimmune phase of the illness, where all the organ systems collapse. And we think that pill is going to help prevent that, and it also may prevent scarring in the lungs. So that's just one example of the myriad of things that are happening in trying to tackle this difficult illness. Just to back up a little bit, so this, and you all may have seen this before, but this illness basically has 3 to 4 phases. We used to say 3, but there's probably a 4th phase. The first phase is the viral phase, when people are getting fever, sore throat, maybe even asymptomatic. And then as the illness goes on, that transitions into the pneumonia phase or pneumonitis phase, where you get lung inflammation, low oxygen levels, and then, and oftentimes right before that, people have a sense of loss of taste and smell, which is kind of a bizarre symptom and can persist. And then if the infection or the illness progresses, and some people, they get better after that, but if it progresses, you go into the immune phase where the kidneys shut down, you get clotting disorders, the lungs completely shut down, and you have a high mortality rate. Now, another therapeutic intervention that we've been making is an IL-6 inhibitor called tocilizumab or Actemra, that's been used for different arthritic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. And that's also been very impressive. When people go into the hyperimmune phase, we give them the tocilizumab, it just shuts it off. The fevers of 104, 105 go away, usually within a day, and it can just kind of turn things around. Now, I mentioned a limited supply of plasma, convalescent plasma and remdesivir. We also have a very limited supply of the tocilizumab. It costs about $5,000 per course. We have enough for about 27 patients right now if they were to come in. So fortunately, with the other treatments, we've been able to prevent people in general from getting that far and haven't had to use as much of the tocilizumab as we did at first. So we do have ways of intervening. We're not helpless, and we're not hopeless. But we need to do a better job educating the public and kind of enforcing the mask issue, because that's going to be the biggest intervention that we can make as a populace, and also the best way to keep the economy open and not have the devastating economic impacts that we've had already, or not have worsening economic impacts. Let's see. Okay, so there's several questions here. It says, what is convalescent plasma? Where do you get it? So the convalescent plasma is basically taking someone who's already been infected, drawing out their blood and separating out the red blood cells. And what you have left after you separate out the red blood cells is the plasma, which contains antibodies. And antibodies are part of the immunity. And so we're initially, when we were doing this, the first patient, the first donor that we had for convalescent plasma had been only well for 2 weeks, because in Kentucky, we got hit by this illness at the beginning of March, and we were looking at trying to treat a patient at the end of March, and there just weren't very many people around who had recovered and weren't infectious and had been well for 2 weeks. So you go to the blood center, have the blood drawn out, the plasma separated, and we can get 2 to 4 treatment courses for patients. So we can treat 2 to 4 patients with each donor's plasma. And that can be stored, and it can be stored for more than a year. So it is a renewable resource too. So we can have people come in more than once. Usually we're encouraging donors to come in every month or so. And that's something that we really need to get out there in the public, because it looks like it's, we don't have all the data about it. This program that we're doing is through the Mayo Clinic Coalition for Plasma. We anecdotally think that it helps. It looks like it helps to us, and there are reasons to believe that it will help from other outbreaks and other times that it's been used. And right now, without a vaccine, that's one way that we have of providing immunity. So the treatment regimens that I discussed involve, number one, the steroids kind of shutting down the overactive immune response. The plasma sort of giving you immediate immunity, so giving you the antibodies so that you're to boost your immune system to fight off the virus. And then the remdesivir is a direct antiviral antibiotic. And so it's a combination of 3 different things. And then if people don't respond and go on to become more ill, we give the tocilizumab, which just shuts off the hyperimmune response. But again, the places that are getting hit hard by this, Florida, Texas, California, previously New York, they're not going to have the treatments like this. That's why if you're a COVID-19 patient, this is one of the better places to be right now, because we have experience dealing with it. We haven't been overwhelmed. We have the ventilators if necessary, and we have medical staff with experience in treating it.
Great. Allison?
So we've had a question about whether or not you would advise people to travel at this time.
Well, I think it depends on what you're doing when you travel. I would be nervous about traveling in an airplane or in an enclosed environment where people weren't wearing masks or weren't wearing face shields. I think it's not just, and by the way, it's not just the masks, but face shields can be an important part of, preventing illness also. And it really depends on what you're doing when you're traveling. If you're traveling and going to enclosed environments and going to a bar, going to a big party and dancing, and that's going to be an issue. That's going to be a problem. If you're traveling and going to an island with one house on it and not having to, going over on the boat yourself and not having anyone around, then that's not an issue. So, when we went to South Carolina, we felt like it was safe because we were renting a house, didn't have anyone else there, bought the food ourselves. I had to go to the grocery store a few times, but I have to go here too sometimes, and was wearing a mask. But I think it depends on the behavior of the people that you're around and your own behavior. I personally wouldn't want to be traveling to a state that's having a major outbreak right now, because if you're going to a place where all their ICUs are full, you're going to be in trouble if you get sick.
That makes a lot of sense. Right, and can you talk to us for just a minute about the different levels of protection the different face coverings provide? So I know you mentioned face masks, the full face masks, but also is there a difference between the cloth masks and the surgical masks? Anything like that?
Well, so I think when the government came out saying that people initially, the CDC saying people shouldn't be wearing face masks, I think there were several issues there. One was that they were concerned that that everyone would go out and buy all the face masks, and that the healthcare workers wouldn't have any face masks. The people who were at higher risk of needing it. I think that the one thing that wasn't recognized at first is that the mask can be reused. And so we started pretty rapidly, when we gave people a mask, saying, okay, here's your, like we did in our office, here's your 3 masks, alternate days, hang it up and let it dry, and alternate days. We'll replace it when it becomes soiled, you get a hole in it or something like that. And that's what we've had to do. We didn't, in the past, we didn't even think about using a face mask. We put it on to go in a room, walk out and throw it away, go in another room, put one on, walk out and throw it away, because there were plenty of masks and we never even had to think about it. And the same thing with the N95 masks. The cloth masks, I think, are helpful because, first off, we don't have enough of the other masks for everyone to be using multiple ones a day, everyone in the country. The cloth masks are reusable, washable, and they do prevent your own respiratory droplets from getting out. They don't provide as much protection for the wearer as a surgical mask, or certainly not as much as an N95 mask, but they do provide some level of protection, and they contain the respiratory droplets that people spew out when they talk, when they sing, when they yell. I mentioned the face shields. That's something that's I think is also important if you're in a high-risk environment, like in the hospital when we're taking care of the coronavirus patients. We not only have a mask on, but we also have a face shield on. And the face shield helps protect your whole face, your eyes. The eyes could potentially be a portal of entry, a mucosal surface where the virus could get in. We don't know how important the eyes are. We think that it's probably an issue. And so we've been encouraging facial coverings and especially eye coverings for a long time. I think the face mask may be a way to lower the risk in certain environments where you just can't really, the face shields where you can't really wear a mask. So my personal trainer, who I'm just seeing by FaceTime now early in the morning to work out, she's seeing some people in the gym, very limited number, separated, and they're having them wear face shields. And because it's really, I think it's impossible to exercise with a mask on if you really exert yourself. I just don't know how you do it. She told me she was very impressed when after people had worked out, the whole inside of the face shield is just covered with droplets that would have otherwise spewed out on her. I think if you look at less unsafe ways, I can't really say safe, but less unsafe ways to open schools, it probably involves face shields, especially in younger children. I think there's a way that people could potentially teach younger children to wear face shields. I know my daughter lives in South Africa and sent me some pictures of some face shields that they produce there with, they have unicorns on them and kind of decorated up almost like a costume. And I think that it could be done in such a way to make it more amenable for kids to wear a face shield, especially younger kids. It's going to be hard to have them wear a mask. I think the older kids probably, in order to really open school and keep it open, you're going to have to wear a mask. I think if schools proceed with opening and no one's wearing a mask, they're not going to stay open very long. We know that schools are virus factories. They have always been virus factories. They've always been places where every kind of respiratory virus gets passed around, and every kind of GI bug gets passed around. And, I know that there's obviously, critical issues about opening schools, and those have all been brought up, and I know that those are important, but they're not going to stay open very long if they're just massive virus factories that are occurring right before we have respiratory virus season, and then we're having to deal with all the other respiratory viruses, including influenza and COVID-19 on top of it. We were hoping that things would settle down over the summer. We thought, okay, this is March, we're at the end of respiratory virus season. Maybe things like they do with influenza will settle down some over the summer, and then we'll get hit hard again in the winter, and we'll be better prepared for it and so forth. But that hasn't panned out, has it? I mean, look at all the southern states, Brazil, everything, it just hasn't really made a difference with coronavirus. And so I think it's unfortunate, but it looks like we're going to be in this for the long haul until we have a vaccine, and until we have a vaccine that is acceptable for the majority of the public. We think that it's going to be somewhere around 60 to 70% of people will have to be taking the vaccine before, you can develop what's called herd immunity and drop off the transmission rate. And right now there's so much anti-vaccine talk and so much anxiety. I don't know what's going to happen even when the vaccines are introduced. So it's going to be an interesting and fascinating time, and there's always something new and different going on with coronavirus, almost every single day, a new challenge. Let's see if there's some other questions. Yeah, so I've seen several employees mention that they've seen posting on social media that points out that cloth masks are useless as they don't protect like a mask with the respirator. Okay, so one of the things I want to point out is that the masks that have a valve in them shouldn't be allowed. We don't allow them in the hospital. That's not protecting anyone else. That's a one-way valve. So it's forming part of the function of the mask is to protect you. The main function of the mask is to prevent your secretions on going to someone else. If you have a valve in the mask, that's still spewing your secretions out onto someone else. So valve masks should not be allowed. It is true that cloth masks don't protect the wearer as much as a surgical mask or as an N95, but that doesn't mean that they're useless.
Good to know.
Can herd immunity be reached without a vaccine? I personally think that's a very dangerous concept. That's a really good question. We know that Sweden tried that. They first said it was obvious that they were trying it. They said they didn't, and then they said that they were trying it, and then they said they weren't. And even after they had not had any restrictions, closed bars down, left the restaurants open, had a large proportion of their elderly population die in comparison to other Western countries, and especially in comparison to their Nordic neighbors. They had gotten nowhere close to herd immunity. We know that herd immunity is going to be probably, it looks like 60 to 70% of the population needs to be immune. Well, the other issue there is is the immunity solid? Do you have neutralizing antibodies? So the other thing is that just because you've had COVID-19, that doesn't mean that you couldn't get it again. We know that some people already have waning antibody levels. I was just on a Zoom video, a statewide Zoom video that we do every 2 weeks now. We were doing it every week, but we have different speakers on it. And the speaker from Columbia University said they had a patient who came in and had very high neutralizing antibodies and was a plasma donor. And then they checked him 3 months later and he has no antibodies. And so some people are going to develop transient immunity and then the immunity is going to wane. And so if in that scenario that, we don't know if people are going to be getting it again. I think it's certainly possible that people could get it again. We actually need a vaccine that is going to hopefully develop more solid immunity than natural infection in most people. So that's going to be another difficult task. So I think that shooting for herd immunity without a vaccine is going to be dangerous and difficult. We're going to have lots of mortality from it. We know also one of the other things that's kind of interesting is that, and maybe not too surprising, but the patients who become more ill seem to have higher antibody levels. The younger patients who tend to not get that ill with it sometimes aren't developing neutralizing antibodies, and they're potentially going to get it again. We don't know if they're going to have a less severe illness, probably, or they could conceivably have a more severe illness a second time, probably less severe. But I just don't think that trying to reach herd immunity by not having anyone wear a mask and everyone go to the bar and sing in each other's face and have COVID-19 parties, I think that's going to be a problem.
Wow, this is fascinating, Dr. Doherty. We really appreciate your input. Any final question? Because I think we could go on all morning. This is super, and I know some of your fans dialed in for this, and I know they're appreciating this. We really appreciate you being with us. Anything else? Final words, Dr. Doherty?
No, I think I pretty much said my piece. I think everyone's probably gotten the point here. So we're doing, from a medical standpoint, we're doing a lot better. We have the personal protective equipment. We have more testing. We have actually, for the time period that we've had, just 4 to 5 months, we have much better therapeutics than we had at the first. We think we can save lives. We have to not get overwhelmed, and we have to have everyone in the population caring for each other. It's not just about yourself. It's about preventing other people from becoming ill. Young people can go out and say, hey, we're not going to get that sick from it. Let's go out to a party. Let's go to the bar. But they might not pay the price, but their granny's going to pay the price. And that's the whole theme here. We've got to be supportive of each other and watching out for each other.
All right. Thank you very much. Boy, we appreciate your being with us. And so everybody knows, we make a copy of this thing. We're recording it. So we'll have it on our website. If anybody wants to go back and share it with anyone, they're certainly welcome to do that. Get this word out as very best you can. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Doherty. Jim Morris, are you ready to go? You've got some good information for us, I know. So
I hope so.
Jump in and take it away.
You ready to roll?
Let's rock and roll.
All right. So the CDC, just to follow up, I moved this up to the top to follow up on the doctor's information. I'm just going to roll through this. CDC since June 22nd added to their symptomology. We talked before about the fever and chills, the cough, the shortness of breath, muscle aches, headaches, new sense of taste, new loss sense of taste or smell. Those are the ones that were on there. I'm sorry, and a sore throat. They came up with 3 more. I just want to make sure that we covered all of these since we had done this at the beginning. Congestion or runny nose, nausea or vomiting, and diarrhea. So keep in mind those particular types. That's what the CDC is asking. And as employers, when you're doing your questionnaires, we have been doing the questionnaire, the temperature check with all of the screening you're supposed to do. These are new ones, and you are supposed to update when the CDC updates. So this was one I almost sent an email blast out to everyone saying, hey, change your questionnaire, because if you get caught with the wrong one, and again, this goes back to my concern over the governor failing to provide any kind of guidance on what the safe at work, healthy at work officers' obligations are. But you are obligated to maintain compliance with the CDC nonstop. So if you haven't been asking these additional questions, that's a problem. So you need to verify what you're asking. Make sure you include all 10 of these instead of 7. And if you haven't asked all of these at the end, you need to start. The concern, of course, with all of this is, what do you do if somebody says yes? If they have congestion or runny nose and they say yes. Everyone has seasonal allergies right now. Hay fever is one of the big ones. Unfortunately, there's no guidance for us on what you should do. My recommendation to the people that I've been providing guidance to is send that person for a test, one of the quick tests, not the one that they put it all up completely in what feels like your brain. Have them get that negative test, and then if they have the same exact symptomology with no other additional, then I think you're safe to conclude that that is an ongoing issue with that person that is not related to COVID. But it's scary right now because we are not getting the guidance from the governor as to what they expect, but you're mandated to follow the 14 steps or else you're liable to both employees and to customers. We begged him for an immunity on that. That fell on deaf ears, so I don't know what we're going to be listing or how we're going to be handling it. But a question that was asked on the chat is this the only list because it's different than before? And the answer is yes. Let me show you from the CDC. I know the fatigue was on there, and oops, sorry, I'm not able to get my mouse to move over there. There it is. These are the symptoms from the CDC, and when you click on it, the list that they have is the one, oh, I'm sorry, fatigue. How did that not get on there? All right. So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Sorry about that. So hold on just a second. We're going to make that change right now since this will end up in the, and this may not fit. I'm going to put it, there you go.
Get it on there.
So I added it, it's supposed to say 8 to 11, not 12. And so the fatigue is now on there. I just added it in while we were doing the slide. My apologies. There's your fatigue right there because I didn't want to do a bullet point that got off the end of it. Sorry about that. I am going to move this up too so that that stays on the screen. There you go. It goes back through. Sorry about that. But the fatigue should have been on the bullet point, and I'll fix that on the one before it goes on our website as a slide. But there's a concern here with regard to what you're supposed to do if somebody has those, and I don't have a whole lot of guidance for you because of the issues related to no follow-up on the phases. We've had the phase, we've had it described to us, they told us what to look for, follow the CDC on your questions, but then they don't tell us what to do if it doesn't show up. The other thing, or if one of these symptoms does show up, the governor hasn't stepped in and said what else we need to do. The other thing that we have talked about before in response to the question about the masks, you have to come up with some type of reasonable accommodation along the lines of the shield that the doctor spoke about just a little bit ago. It's your obligation to come up with other technology that you can utilize. Also, keep in mind the governor has not lifted for businesses the fact that if you can remotely work, you're still required to allow your employees to remotely work. We're seeing a lot of issues related to that, and I suspect we're probably going to see some litigation related to that, because if employees are refusing to come back to work, but they could have done their job at home, you're going to find some problems if you're not allowing them to work from home. So, but these are the symptoms. Those are the new 3. You need to add those to your policies and all of your questionnaires. So I am going to come back to that a little bit later because there are some new guidelines I want to walk through with you, things to be careful of in COVID, but I want to step through and talk about the PPP so everybody's up to date on that as well. Then we'll get back to the list of concerns alphabetically. So the PPP was extended. You now have through August the 8th, 2020 instead of the June 30th, 2020 deadline. As of the date that the original was going to be expired, there were 4.8 million businesses that had already applied. There was still $130 billion that remained. If you haven't done this and you've been listening to me for 18 weeks, I don't know how else to help you because I've walked you through every step of the PPP. If you meet the criteria, and there were several ways to meet that, and we walked through it in week 2 and week 3. You need to go ahead and make sure that you apply for it. Also, if you're a small business, meaning, self-employed, independent contractor, sole proprietor, C Corp, S Corp, you're going to see here in a minute, all of them and partnerships, you get some relief out of this. So you need to apply if you have not already done so. Congress passed the PPP Extension Act to allow for additional small businesses to benefit. Again, if you haven't done so, apply. It's free money. Your taxes are going to pay for it later, whether you like this or not, so you need to make sure. August the 8th will probably be the absolute last extension because this is costing a fortune for the SBA to supervise. The U.S. Treasury is getting frustrated with all the changes and all of the updates, all the things that they have to do. So I suspect August the 8th is the drop dead. Another critical, I'll put them both up there. Another critical update that we were wanting to make sure you understood, and this goes to basically the self-employed independent contractor type. It was on June the 11th, but I don't believe I covered it enough, so I wanted to go ahead and make sure I covered it more. It talked about Schedule C filers and considering themselves paid, sorry about the typo, up to 20.833% of their Schedule C 2019 income. And so I walked through that because there's so many small businesses, and some of you are on here, and I've spoken to some of you and had some of you ask questions privately. There is a benefit for you, and they have walked through specifically how to do that calculation. Two other safe harbors, we've talked about this in week 12, 13, and 14, but I just want to throw it out here because it's been a little while. The governmental guidelines caused a reduction, and good help is hard to find, and they actually literally are calling it both of those. So the governmental guidelines are that there's a state, local, or federal shutdown requirement, and because of that shutdown, you can't work or you can't have an open-facing business or front-facing business, as I've called them. You have the ability to keep that money and not get punished for not utilizing it as required. And the good help is hard to find reduction is if you have applied or you've tried to get employees and you simply cannot get qualified employees during the requisite time period, you have the ability to apply and demonstrate your efforts and not have to repay that money either. So, all right. A couple of other updates on the PPP, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I just want you to know that it's out there. The U.S. Treasury and the SBA have come out with the EASY form, new application forms for those of you that didn't apply the first time, and new calculation forms or new calculation strategies. On June 26th, they popped out with a new explanation for calculation of maximum loan amounts. It included information for your self-employed with or without employees, partnerships, S-Corp, C-Corp, LLC, nonprofit, religious nonprofits, and self-employed. And by the new self-employed, what they mean is non-operational for the time period, because if you'll remember, we talked about having to compare your 2019 and how much money you had in 2019, and that's how you came up with your 2.5 months or 8 weeks of pay. I'm sorry, 10 weeks of pay. This has some more guidelines for you. So if you're looking to apply, take a look at their website. Easy loan forgiveness form. It's a streamlined process for anybody who does not have a really complex situation. Now, I've listed out what they are here. Make sure you pull the form because it has some additional on there. The SBA, let me see if it's in here. I may have closed out of it. So it's on this page here, and if you click on them, here's the easy form right here. The form instructions are on there. But if you go to their website, you'll have the ability to pull that up. Basically what it is to get the easy application, you have to be self-employed, an independent contractor, a sole proprietor with no employees, or no reduction in wages by more than 25%, and no reduction in the number of employees, or no reduction in wages, and you're unable to operate at the same level due to governmental restrictions. So they've spelled that out. If you meet any one of those, feel free to go ahead and apply on the easy form. It's basically a rubber stamp form. I don't want to call it that necessarily, but you can fly through without much issue. Remember, it's not the SBA, it's not the U.S. Treasury, it's actually the bank that you obtained your loan from. That's the bank that will actually be approving it, but this streamlines the process. The last one is they have on there a PPP loan forgiveness form. These were updated right before our last meeting, but SBA was not one of our hot topics during that week. And so the SBA loan forgiveness form, this is the what I call the long form. This is for those that do not fall under the easy loan forgiveness form. It's a detailed with instructions. It addressed some of the gaps and some of the confusion from the earlier forms that I pointed out at the end of, close to the end of May when we had our meeting and I talked about, or our webinar, and I talked about some of the gaps in the brand new form that came out. This now updated that. All right, so Next, potential legal issues. This is where I'm going to walk through with some alphabetical issues for you. We've talked about this, I think, back in week 13, but I wanted to bring it back because as you're reopening and you're dealing with this, these are the critical things that you're going to have to really deal with. In the benefits department, I'm really concerned about contract and legal compliance along with your administrative policies, the ERISA type things that you're going to have to talk about with regard to continuing or ending coverage due to a reduction, a layoff, a furlough, or reduction just in hours. Have you complied with all of your contractual obligations for medical benefits, retirement benefits? Are you properly continuing those? That's something you're going to have to really focus on. Remember when we talked about this, this is 100% contract law. You have a contract with your medical care provider, you better make sure that you are in compliance with that. If you laid people off to working only half the time, and your contract requires that people be full-time employed, you better get that cleared through your vendor for medical coverage. Contracts. Speaking of contracts, you're going to have a huge influx of issues with regard to breach of contracts, employment-related typically, with regard to reduction, pay cuts, and furloughs. There are three different ones here. You'll notice non-compete and force majeure. First one, with the breach of contract, if you have a contract with an employee, you need to make sure that you supplemented with that employee when they come back, and also you may end up with litigation related to the pay cuts, because if it's not in the contract and you didn't have some type of limitation on what you were allowed to do, you need to try to shore that up very quickly. Non-competes are going to be a big issue. We've talked about it several different weeks. In this particular situation, I think non-competes are going to be dead for a long time, and it's just my opinion. There's nothing in Kentucky yet. I pulled out the Pennsylvania last week and shared with you the district court from the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. I think that's what you're going to see a lot of now. Courts are not going to be inclined to protect an employer against competition when you've laid people off. The other thing is, and I've had this actually happen and I've given guidance on it, if you laid people off, you terminated that contract. If you rehire them after a termination where they received unemployment, that's a new agreement with that individual. So some of these non-competes you may have invalidated simply by laying people off or firing them, furloughing them, whatever you want to call it. But I suspect you're going to see a lot of issues on the non-compete and whether or not you can enforce those. The third one is force majeure. For anybody that doesn't understand what that is, it's basically act of God in a contract. You're going to see a lot of issues related to that because this is the first time that it has actually been widely utilized to shut down people's obligations. If you have contracts related to your company, and those contracts, 99% of them have a force majeure clause, with the big boys anyway. Hotels, convention bureaus, those types of things, you have force majeure clauses. Start looking into those because you can get out of contracts right now. So those are the contract. COVID-19 regulation or legislation litigation. You're going to have some issues with regard to compliance and non-compliance with the FFCRA, state and local, and retaliation claims. You need to start building into your policies COVID-19, making sure that you do comply with and that your managers know to comply with all of these policies and procedures. Discrimination and retaliation, we've talked about this many times, national origin, race, disability, FMLA related to layoffs, rehire, etc. You need to shore all of that up because that's going to be the next hotbed, and we're going to have a whole lot of that going on. I don't know why some of these popped in individually and others didn't. It was obviously my mistake, but I'd rather get them all out here anyway so you can look at them. Employee expenses, remember what I told you before about work from home reimbursement. If you have people working from home, they're utilizing their own electricity, their own cell phones, their own Wi-Fi, office supplies, etc. You need to make sure that you are properly reimbursing. Also, a little side note, remember what we talked about, I think in week 4 or 5, about the security issues related to people working from home. If they're using their own Wi-Fi, if they are using their cell phones, do they have their cell phone shut down so that they're not accessing some of the things like Siri? We talked about that. We talked about some of the other Google Assist and other things in the home. Those are always listening. If you're dealing with confidential, proprietary, trade secret, or healthcare protected information, all employees have to be instructed, you're on our dime now, you have to shut those things off, because if they're always listening, you're potentially violating PCI, HIPAA, other confidential proprietary information, or patient customer information, credit cards, and so on. So it's your obligation as the employer, if you allow them to work from home, to have the policies in place to make sure they can't utilize any of that information, or that no one else is allowed to listen in. Immigration compliance, I'm not going to waste a lot of time, but those of you who have that, you know what that means, and you need to make sure your H-1B is properly paid. And I think we talked about this in week 6. You're screwed with an H-1B because you're required to continue to pay them, but you cannot pay your state or your U.S. employees if you're mandated to shut down. But that's a lawsuit waiting to happen, and the federal government has still not addressed that. NLRB, retaliation for refusing unsafe working conditions and potential exposure to COVID-19. Also, along with that, I'm going to skip the OSHA for a second, go down to the collective bargaining agreement. You'll remember we talked about the union. This goes along with the NLRB. Be prepared for union organization efforts as a result of your layoffs, furloughs, terminations, reduction in force. The dollar signs at the end, that pertains to the mid-sized companies taking the loan. If you'll recall, in week 4, I believe I talked about the need to make sure that if you took the money from the federal government, not the small business PPP, but there was a mid-sized loan available with a really awesome rate, and I said there are strings attached, and one of those was you waived any ability to challenge a union for I think it was a 5-year time period. So you need to be prepared to address the union relations, and you need to talk to your managers about what they can and what they cannot do. We've done extensive training with managers in the past, and it's a critical step during this time especially, because you're going to have people who are going to start to attempt unionization, especially in the state of Kentucky where work share was approved, adopted, and then not implemented for whatever reason. And employers utilized that to try to continue to operate, but then we're told that they can't utilize that. I see some unionization efforts stepping out of that because people didn't get paid the money that they were promised. So be prepared. Wage and hour, improper calculation, I see that being a huge issue. The other one at the end here, for those that don't know what that means, the donning and doffing of clothes is a huge issue. I use that as a broad-based term to point out to you what we've talked about, where if you're in a high-rise building, which is not a huge issue in Kentucky, but for some of my clients it is, if you have to wait for an elevator, you're on the premises of your employer, but now you can't get to the 37th floor, the 103rd floor, whatever it is. The employer has to pay for that because that person is ready, willing, and able to come to work, but they've had to go through the line to be temperature checked before they go in. And speaking of which, any temperature check you're doing, whether you're doing in-home temperature check or whether you're doing it on-site with the questionnaire, you have to pay them during that time. It is part of the donning and doffing. If you have a job that requires people to be tested before they go in to work, you have to pay for that time. So keep that in mind. I see a tremendous amount of lawsuits are going to come out of that because people believe they don't have to pay their employees while they're asking them questions and while they're standing in line to get temperature checked. Yes, you do, because they're ready to go in, and you're having to test them before they go into the facility. So that's why that's there. The Warren Act compliance, that's pretty much, if you haven't done it, you're already screwed because you're probably reopening at this point. Just keep in mind that you have to comply with that on any kind of mass layoff, and we talked about that in week 1 and week 2. Go back and look at that to see whether you did it right if you didn't. Workers' comp, pretty self-evident, and I won't waste a lot of time on that, except for the retaliation for reporting. Keep in mind, do not retaliate against anybody during COVID, because I see that's going to be a huge issue as well. So those are your main, I did it in 1 page. I reduced it down. There's a lot of other legal issues that could be an issue as well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that page is enough to make some good HR people just throw their hands up and go, forget it, I'm out of here. But the other way to look at it,
it's not intended to scare people, but it is intended to let you know you have to be prepared, because this is the whole new world.
Oh,
and
yeah.
These are the issues: benefits, contracts, legislation, enforcement, discrimination, retaliation, employee expenses, immigration, NLRB and union, OSHA I skipped, but you know what it is, wage and hour, WARN, and workers' comp. These are the issues that this is the new world. And these are going to come out to bite a lot of people. And we're hoping by you all being on this and all the HR people being on here that, hey, keep this slide to the side and just keep telling your people, listen, you need to make sure you have a policy on this, or you need to make sure, and I'm not trying to suggest that you be frozen by inertia, but these are huge issues, and this is not something that's a, quote, remote possibility. These are things that are going to be the new ambulance chaser, employment attorney, plaintiff side, class action, where they can get a lot of money out of a company because they can throw it out there, scare the living heck out of a company, and then move on to the next one.
Well, let me finish. What I was going to say was, on the other hand, you could say, thank goodness for HR, because somebody's taking care of these things. Somebody's aware of it and watching it. So it's
That's
a
right.
two-edged sword, okay? Then, oh my gosh, and thank goodness I can do this stuff.
That's
so,
right.
Good work. I'm glad you've got it all in one place.
Yep, and then I've got 2 more slides here, I think, to go through. Actually, 3 more. Sorry, maybe 4.
That's good. Keep it up.
All right. So the next one is about Kentucky. So this is the big one. So the mask mandate question that the doctor was talking about, it did become law on Friday, but the interesting thing is it is not the law, or it may not be the law. And there is a world of confusion right now in the legal area on this. It has not been covered as much because it happened on a Friday. Governor made a statement Friday afternoon that kind of surprised some of us that are in the legal side of things. But the governor's issued a tremendous number of mandates over the last several months, starting in March with his declaration. On July the 9th, this was entered, if I can get it to come up here. This is a Scott County Circuit Court. This is called a temporary restraining order by the judge in Scott County. It's not a small circuit court. This is a large because of Toyota and a lot of agriculture and so on. So the first part talks about him being enjoined from enforcing, and this is what was on the screen, this part right here. Now, the important part about this particular one is that this enjoins the governor and anyone else acting in conjunction with the governor issuing a Chapter 39A, which is his emergency declaration rights, that he could issue anything, but then it talks about against Evans Orchard or any of the other 548 agritourism businesses in Kentucky currently registered with the Department of Agricultural, which is a typo. But, not my typo, that's a judge's typo. But the issue here is with regard to that language, they can't issue any executive order that relates to an emergency declared against Evans Orchard or any of the other 548. Well, all of his have been broad-based orders. They have not been specific unless it's the guidance that he gave to the specific industries. But the next paragraph on here is also a huge issue, because it says, prior to issuing or enforcing any executive order, secretary's order, or other order or guidance issued pursuant to Rule 39A related to the declaration declared on March 6th, the governor or other person authorized by the governor shall specifically state the emergency that requires the order, the location of the emergency, the name of the local emergency management agency that has determined that the emergency is beyond its capabilities. That's the part that says every executive order that the governor has issued has been enjoined, because this says he cannot enforce any executive order unless he has done the following. He has not done all of those things. However, he came out on Friday afternoon during his press release and said, I am declaring that this is all valid and we're going forward and the mask policy exists. The concern is that the mask policy was issued after the governor's order, but the governor's order was prospective, meaning it said any future order that you issue must have the following steps. There was a letter written by the Attorney General. Put that up there. I did not block copy this. I just wanted you to see it. It was issued by the Attorney General, signed off by him and the Senate and the House speakers as well, pointing out to the governor that he has overstepped with the mask policy and overstepped with several others. And it pointed out to him the several orders that have been entered by both federal and state on page 2 and page 1 of the letter, saying that basically every order that the governor has put out that has been challenged has been deemed to be unconstitutional. So where does that put you right now? Technically speaking, when I read the TRO, this is one attorney's opinion, but a TRO that says that you cannot issue or enforce any of your policies until or unless you do A, B, C, and D, and he has not yet done that, means that all of his executive orders right now are in limbo. But then he comes out and tells all of you on Friday afternoon, screw the judge. I'm sorry, didn't say that, but he came really close. I don't care what the judge says about this. The TRO, screw that. This is enforceable and it's all valid and you are bound to follow it. I had to go out on Friday night and Saturday morning, and I can tell you that all of the businesses are complying because they were all told they had to. I suspect you're going to see several businesses and individuals challenging this in the next few days. The other thing is that the order that was adopted by the governor is the same exact, and I think I told you all this before, there is right now not political, there is a Republican governor game plan and a Democrat governor game plan. They are literally following the identical game plan, and we can just kind of watch the other states and see what's happening in those states, depending on whether it's a governor that is a Republican or a Democrat. Well, Cuomo is the one that's basically leading the Democrat side, and one of the big states that's following it is Michigan. Michigan did this exact same order, and there's now a lawsuit, and I suspect that we're going to have one here from employers saying, now you're putting us at risk because you have said you're going to shut us down and take away our business license if we don't enforce a mask policy. However, if we enforce the mask policy and we get assaulted or we get sued by the customer, you are not giving us any kind of immunity, you're not giving us any kind of authority, and the police won't show up if we tell somebody, put your mask on, and they refuse. So the problem is you're putting businesses in the middle. It's creating all kinds of problems because think about it, if you run a Marshall's department store in Lexington and somebody comes in and they say, I'm not wearing a mask, Are you going to physically preclude them from coming in the building? Are you going to escort them out? Do they get to sue you? It's just like shoplifting. You know, we always tell people, be careful about a shoplifting policy that you allow any of your employees to enforce. You better have a security officer to be the one enforcing. Same issue here. It has created a big problem in Michigan. I suspect it will come here as well because it is the identical policy that is being enforced by Governor Majeure, if it is the law, which I think we'll hear some things from the judge today, because I think that this, or tomorrow, I think that the statement on Friday basically saying, I don't care what the judge says, this is the law. He is an attorney and he is bound to follow, even though he's the governor, he's bound to follow a temporary restraining order until and unless it's been set aside. So I suspect that you're going to see a pointed position taken by someone ASAP. Be prepared for that, because one of the things, not for the governor issue, but your employee, if you are a public-facing business, how are you going to enforce the mask policy? And how are you going to deny access? Are you going to get physical with your customers? Because good luck calling the police. They're not showing up for a mask violation. They're just not. Not in today's age right now with what's going on. They are not going to show up to enforce the failure to wear a mask. I see that being the next issue to be questioned, and I wish that the guidance that came out, when he announced the guidance last week, was coming out on Thursday, we truly thought that we were going to get a whole specific directive across the board on how to handle this. I was fully prepared to walk you through a whole bunch of different things, and the only thing that came out was wear a mask and it's mandatory. I just kind of shook my head, and it's not, like I said, I loved it when Governor Majeure was on here. It's not a political thing. I was just disappointed because that doesn't help you all at all. We've got to help businesses understand how to proceed, and that didn't do it. So, a couple of other things I wanted to cover. The back-to-school primer, a few reminders, and I'm not going to read this all the way through, but we talked about the 2 weeks up to 80 hours of paid sick leave at your regular rate where the employee's unable to work because the employee's been quarantined. That was expanded basically with the government shutdown. I believe that is still applicable because the governor has not lifted the work remotely, if at all possible. So that means that you have to either allow people to work remotely or they're entitled to 2 weeks pay. If they can't, because of the quarantine, unless they're in an area that's now allowed to be open, like the racetracks, the stores, the bars, but if they reshut the bars down, you're going to have to pay the 80 hours if you fall within that. Most of you have already paid this out during the original COVID shutdown, so some of this doesn't apply, but you'll see why I'm pointing it out here in a minute. 2/3 of the employee's regular pay to take care of a child or a quarantined individual. This is where we start thinking about the school-related again. And the third one here, if anybody's been working for you more than 30 days, you have to give them an additional 10 weeks of paid expanded FMLA at 2/3 of the regular rate where an employee is unable to work due to the need to care for a child. This is where it's going to get really dicey when we go back to school. Next week, we're going to cover this a lot. I'm trying to just give you some information now to just be thinking about it, because I'm hoping we get some big school decisions this week that I can then share with you next week what we're doing and how to go about it. But this part down here is just what we talked about before, the different things and how you have to calculate it. I'm not going to waste the time on it. Here are the questions. So if an employee was given a choice, what do we do? What do we do with intermittent leave? What happens at the end of the FFCRA leave time period? Those are the big issues, and I'm going to answer briefly because you have to stay tuned for next week, because there's going to be a whole lot more information that's going to be shared next week. What do you do if the employee is given a choice? This is a really, really tough call. But some of the schools are saying, hey, we're going to give your kid a choice. We're going to give you a choice for your child. You can have them come in every other day. You can have them come in every day for a half day, or you can homeschool them and we will assist you in the homeschooling effort. In that particular instance, if an employee selects the in-home homeschool option, that is not under the FFCRA. Technically speaking, the school is open. You have selected to homeschool your child. That does not get to be under the policy that we just talked about, where it says where the school is closed due to COVID-19. That is an employee self-imposed decision where the employee is saying, I'm going to homeschool my child during this time. That's no longer that the school is closed. So that becomes a big issue that we're going to delve into next week a whole lot, because that's going to raise some big concerns. The next one is intermittent leave. Intermittent leave, for those that don't know, is if it's every other day, or it's usually used in the FMLA if somebody has to go for medical appointments for cancer treatment, for a prenatal checkup, post-pregnancy checkups. You have to give them leave to be able to go to the doctor, or they may be sick, but they can work part of the time. That's called intermittent leave. Well, intermittent leave is allowed, and we talked about this for several weeks early on, under the FFCRA. So you are allowed intermittent leave if it is as a result of an intermittent need. If the school goes every other day, and that's where, like the high schools in Fayette County, one of the things they floated out there is we're thinking about one group's there on Monday and Wednesday, the other group's there on Tuesday and Thursday, and everyone is homeschooled on Friday. In that instance, if you have a child, I can see you would have to go to school or go to work 2 days a week. You could apply to your employer for 3 days a week leave, because Friday everyone's homeschooled, Monday and Wednesday, or Tuesday and Thursday they're homeschooled, and you have to be at home on one of those days, on 3 of those days, basically. I have highly recommended to employers that they change their policies, and what we have done is we have changed your at-home policy so that you can, in fact, have your children there, and you can, in fact, walk away, and we're basically doing flex time, at-home flex time. If you have to homeschool your child for an hour every morning, go homeschool your child for an hour, have them working in the same room as you. And if they make noises, if this is a baby and the baby starts to cry, if you need to go nurse your child, allow your employees to do those types of things, because otherwise you're going to be paying them to do nothing but to homeschool their child. So we have gone through and implemented full-blown at-home policies, allowing a child with you at home, allowing you to work and do different things, because if you don't, you're in big trouble with regard to your workforce, because how many of you have people with children, and how many of those children are going to end up being homeschooled at least half the day, part of the day, all the time, part of the time. Now again, going back to this first one, if the employee selects voluntarily to have the child homeschooled, they do not qualify under the FFCRA. So I would highly recommend that you tell your employees, unless you're going to willingly do this, that they are not allowed to voluntarily select the homeschooling. They have to let the school tell them the school is going to be closed on certain days at certain time. Otherwise, they can't select the assistance that you can give them. So here's what you all need to be focused on. We're going to try to go through some of this next week in detail. You need to develop new handbooks, policies, procedures, and structure from work from home. That's what I was talking about with regard to if a baby cries during a seminar, a Zoom meeting, who cares in this day and age? Everybody has it happen. If you will remember when we had Governor Majeure on here, it was kind of funny, but it was, I've seen it in almost every Zoom meeting I've had. His little girl in her pajamas came walking across the back of the screen behind him, and he said, and there's my little girl coming into the screen behind us. And we all kind of chuckled about it, but nobody cares anymore. Allow your employees to have their children around. Your employees will appreciate that. People will get a little smile out of it, and you still allow work to get done. You need to properly document all time off, because if you go back to the issues that we talked about, you're going to have some challenges to your FFCRA. You're going to have issues related to my 80% off, my 100% off, or 100% of my salary, all the different calculations that are out there. You need to properly document and force your employees to properly document, or at the end of the 12 weeks, you and your employees are going to have all kinds of disputes. You need to assure compliance with all of your handbooks, policies, procedures, and agreements. This goes back to almost every week we've had, but you have serious issues with people working from home. You need to make sure that they are on the clock when they're on the clock, they're off the clock when they're off the clock. Nobody else has access to your PCI, HIPAA compliant, confidential proprietary trade secret documentation, and so on, that they don't have Siri working, that they don't have Google Assist on that people can listen into. You need to make sure you have all of those protections built in. You need to build relationships with your employees that allow for work from home and homeschooling. You need to build relationships with your employees that make them understand that you care about them during this time, because whether you think that this is easier on them because now they get to have their child with them and they get the FFCRA and they get all this different stuff, keep in mind this is extraordinarily stressful for your employees. Most of them are not set up to be teachers. They were forced to homeschool the last semester. There's a lot of people out there confused, scared, concerned. If you show them a level of compassion now, and you walk them through what you're doing to help them, it will work tremendously for you in your relationship building and your employee loyalty to you. They will return it to you tenfold if you do for them what is the right thing now. So next week we'll have a lot more information. We'll address some of these issues in more detail, because we're hopeful we'll have more guidance from both the state and the local. And I don't have a slide for it because the work-share is still broken. The response from them to all of the employers is it just doesn't exist until the federal government adopts it. I don't know where they're getting that. The state law is a state law. As soon as it was signed into law by the governor, he directed that this take place, and we have not had any further guidance on that. So, the question that I do see on there, there was a question about and we are on the question, sorry, let me get to that. What do you do in situations where an employee cannot wear a mask due to a medical condition? You have to come up with reasonable accommodations with the screens. You have to allow them to work remotely. And if they can't do either, then you have to put them on leave under the FFCRA and or ADA and or FMLA. Because if they cannot protect themselves and others, then they fall under the protections that are there. Be very careful in this. We did talk at length about this. Be very careful about telling someone that you're going to not allow them to work because they can't wear a mask. You have to figure out every reasonable accommodation under ADA. You have to be proactive as the employer. You have to ask the questions, and you have to figure out ways to make that work. Do not just say, well, sorry, you can't do anything, and that's it. So that's one. Do we need to obtain the proper full-time equivalency by the specified date? Or must we maintain it throughout? You have to, all right, so question about the full-time equivalency under the PPP, you have to get that by your choice, 8-week or the end of the year. You have to have that, but remember you also have to have the calculations under the PPP that meet the 25%, or you have to run through that calculation that basically the remainder of the 25% will only be paid to the extent that you use payroll. We went through those calculations. They were nightmarish when it was a 60-40, and then they changed it. So just make sure you get your accountant involved with that. But it is by the date of whichever time period you elected, the 24-week, the 8-week time period. So, oh, the H-1B. All right. Can I repeat what I was saying? H-1B, the problem is under an H-1B visa, you are not allowed to lay those people off. So there was a huge issue under the federal government didn't give us any guidance on this. During a time of a mandated shutdown, your U.S. employees that you laid off and furloughed can sue you now because you didn't lay off your H-1B because you can't lay off H-1B, so now you're discriminating against U.S.-based employees to the benefit of an H-1B foreign national. However, if you don't pay your H-1B, then your H-1B can sue you because you can't lay them off under the H-1B. We walked through the different options you had, which was you could put them on a vacation if they were willing to do so themselves. You could terminate them and hope to get them back, but the problem with that step was you can't really do that because the federal government had put them at the back of the line and they shut down screenings, and so you ran the risk of losing your H-1B. So basically, and I did short shrift that because it's so complicated, you had to lay off, if you had to shut down at any point in time, your U.S.-based employees, you were technically required to continue paying your H-1Bs, but you didn't pay your U.S. You treated them differently based upon them being a foreign national, and that's illegal under our laws. So the problem was you were in a catch-22 if you did pay, and if you didn't, then you were in violation of the H-1B obligation, and so that's the nightmare that you have, and that's why I think there's going to be some litigation out of that because U.S.-based employees are looking at that going, I didn't get paid, and you paid them, and they didn't work. I didn't work. We're similarly situated, but there was no differentiation from the federal government, so you're still in trouble on that. And if you're in that situation, sorry, I don't have anything. There's no guidance out there. So, no. To the question about the Healthy at Work original order about 6 feet away, no. He came out with a follow-up to that, and so did the CDC. And since he follows the CDC, the question is, if you can just be 6 feet away, do you not have to wear a mask? And the answer is no. If you're in a room with anyone else, you have to wear a mask. The only time you can not wear a mask is if you are in a room by yourself. That is the directive that has been given. Otherwise, you have to have a mask on, and you're supposed to also have the social distancing, and you're supposed to also have, to the extent possible, the plexiglass, so on and so forth. Yeah, to the comment about the mask requirement staying in place, but the businesses have to be given protection, that's what I've been begging for, some kind of guidance, some kind of information related to the, there has to be immunity, there has to be, this has to be a state mandated, not a, you can't have businesses police this, but yet when you're saying police aren't going to show up, the police aren't going to police it, so it's going to become a hotbed for issues. You can't get sued for walking somebody out as long as you don't physically assault them. But there's been no guidance from the governor that we will protect employers for enforcing the mask policy. That's the issue. We'll have people run out all time. Oh yeah, that's what I was saying is at the end, so the comment about the FFCRA back to school, eventually everybody's going to run out of time. The federal government's either going to have to change that, or you're going to start to have lawsuits for people related to familial discrimination, the fact that you are laying people off because they have families. Well, you have to because they're not able to work. So that's where I was talking about the discrimination under FFCRA. You're going to have some challenges to that. just be prepared for it. The best thing to do is to have the policy, and like I said, I think that you would be really mindful, or you'd be really wise to be mindful about making it available for people to have their children in the workplace, in the remote workplace. Don't bring them into the regular where they could be a germ pool and you could get them exposed or anything else. But working from home, that's a big issue. If they do get sent home from symptoms, yes, you can use their regular sick. Remember, there was also the sick leave related to COVID, which is separate from the FFCRA. So if you send somebody home because of symptoms while you're waiting for the test, they can get paid. They could also use the personal sick leave, but they are not required to, and you cannot force them to use their personal. Remember, that was part of week 1 and week 2 under the FFCRA and the CARES Act, that you cannot force people to use their banked leave, but you do have to pay them if they actually have the symptoms. Well, now if you're doing the screening and you send them home because of it, you have to pay them during that time while they're waiting for the test. If they have exhausted their FFCRA, you can't help them out unless you're doing it voluntarily. We talked about this. Once you've exhausted it, that's it. And those that had FMLA before, and now you go back under FMLEA, you only get 12 weeks total in that time period. You don't get 12 plus whatever you had before. It's an extension of, not in addition to. Let's see, if employees are having a test at the hospital, they're requiring them to get tested and they feel like they can claim. Yeah, the question was basically if they're getting tested and they're waiting for the results and they're required to be quarantined for 3 days, are they allowed to do that? The answer is if they get a directive from a doctor that they need to quarantine while they wait, yes. That's from the doctor, so you have to follow that. And the same thing applies if you send them home because they have the sniffles, because they have diarrhea, because they have fatigue. Any of the things on that list that you're doing in your questionnaire that you are required, mandated by the governor to do, you have to send them home. You have to pay them while you wait. That's under this act, so be careful. No, on the question about the employee being quarantined due to a spouse having COVID, the question would be, this is really close, that's why I hesitate for a second. If the person shows up and says, I'm tired, my wife has COVID, now they've answered your test question. Now you may have to pay them for the 14-day time period. If, however, they call you proactively and they say, my spouse has COVID, what do I need to do? Then they're going to be, they'll be eligible under the FFCRA, because they're caring for or at home with someone who has COVID, or because they have to self-quarantine, but they won't be eligible for the potential use of the sick leave under the same act because they themselves have to self-quarantine. It's going to be a really close juggle. It's going to be a case-by-case. You're going to need guidance from legal. You're going to need to have HR heavily involved, because that hypothetical, person shows up and says, answers the questions and goes, yeah, I'm tired, yeah, I have muscle ache and I have a runny nose, and by the way, my wife has COVID. Send them home, number one. Number two, they may be able to get the direct sick leave themselves if they haven't already exhausted it, because they've now answered your questions, you send them for testing, and now you're going to keep them at home because their wife has COVID. If, however, they call you, they can't get the self one because they didn't answer the questions for themselves. They're not the one that's sick, but their spouse is, and now they have to quarantine as a result of a directive from the CDC. They'll fall under the different provision, and let me show you those really quick because it is a whole, here, this one. See, they would be subject to a quarantine or isolation order if their spouse had it, or they would be advised to self-quarantine. But they wouldn't fall under number 3 And remember, there were different pay calculations. I didn't pull all that in here because it took us almost a whole seminar just to talk about the different pay that's going, or the different calculations based upon the different number. If it was 1 through 4, but not 5 and maybe 6, we had all kinds of things that we talked about. But it would depend on how they answered. If they have the symptom, that's number 3. Those are the people that answer your questions. If they experience symptom, you have to send them for medical diagnosis before they can come in. Then all of those people that answer any of your questions on the questionnaire fall under 3. That's the issue, and that's where that's going to become a nightmare, because the list of the COVID-19 things that we talked about way back at the beginning, and I'm going to pop them all up here. Hopefully they're all on the screen. Yeah. That's a long list, and people can come in every day with a different symptom, and now you're having to deal with that every day. It's a nightmare with those questions. That was not the intent. But the other question, there's one on there about sharing policies. I'll leave that up to you guys. There's no accommodation for this. Oh. If you don't have any ability to have an accommodation for a particular position, meaning that they cannot come to work without a mask. We talked about this week 12, I think, where we said you had to come up with a different job. We talked about it a lot with the older workers, that you should encourage them to no longer be the Walmart greeter, but you cannot stop them from not being the Walmart greeter. But if there's a mandatory mask policy put in place by the governor and it sticks, you are required to have them wear a mask. If they cannot wear a mask and perform the job, then you should be looking for another job for them to do, and that was the guidance from the EEOC on the older workers and so on. You can't preclude them from doing their job unless they have to wear a mask. You should figure out another job that they could do safely, but allow them to do their job if they wear their mask. If they refuse to wear a mask, can't wear a mask, and there's no other job for them, then you have to do your own thing, but you better get legal guidance, because that's a very dicey situation. And I'm not trying to drum up business, I'm just telling you that is a very, very close issue. I'll address any others, or you can start asking them, guys. I'm not trying to, I was trying to read them as quick as I could, but.
The last slide, Jim, so people can get the codes.
Yeah.
For the term and HRCI if they need them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are continuing to get credit for education if you need those. So notice those codes right there. And we've gotten them for all 15 of these. You can pretty much fill up your entire requirement for the year by listening to these presentations. Jim, great job. Anybody else have anything important that's come in? More questions? Allison, did he miss any?
And I'm fine with any of these. I just haven't had a chance to read through them. I'm trying to answer them right now.
Yeah.
I will say this was a pretty important one. If you are permanently laying people off, FFCR, we talked about this, I think, in week 5. FFCRA, and this is right before the April 1st implementation, so maybe it was week 3. It was a critical update from the government on the FFCRA. They came out and said, if a business is reducing force, laying off, terminating, closing its doors, whatever it was doing, then you do not have to pay the FFCRA. It was an either or. So if you are going through that, then no, you do not have to pay that. So trying to answer these if we can, but I don't know how long we were scheduled to go. We've gone almost 2 hours. Sorry.
All right. Let's call it a wrap. I want to mention one last thing. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We hope this has been very helpful. I noticed many have hung on the whole time. We did kick off a new series last Wednesday, helping people find a job during the pandemic. You know, we have a lot of talent around that, so we just decided some of our employees said we want to help too, and they aren't on these calls, but they have a lot of talent. So Ray Davis and John Coffey and other special guests are doing a Wednesday series on finding a job during the pandemic. It's the same time frame, 11 o'clock We're putting it out to all our mailing lists, but if you missed it or want some more information about it, don't hesitate to let me know personally. We'll make sure you get an invite to it. And the one that we did last week, which is really great about thinking through, what are you going to look for? How are you going to look for something that makes a difference for you? It's already on our website, so people could catch up then and then join us on Wednesday. So that's the scoop. God bless every one of you. Keep safe and healthy. We, boy, thank Mark for all that he did for us. Jim, continue to be just terrific. Thank you very much for joining us. We're signing off. Have a great week. Talk to you next week.
Thank you all.